About 5 years ago, I was invited to contribute a poem to PM Review's memorial issue for John Ashbery, which I did. And then I thought that I would read that poem, which was sort of a collage-y poem, and then talk a little bit about Ashbery's influence on my work. But I couldn't find the poem, and searched quite a lot, and it wasn't on PM Review's website. In fact, I would have had to take out a costly subscription to access my own poem. And I searched all of my different email addresses and alter egos, still could not track this down. Eventually found it on an old work laptop. By this point, about 2 weeks had passed and the poem had taken on a sort of talismanic quality to me, that this was clearly the best poem that I had ever written, and it was lost to me, and it was the most relevant and the thing that I had to find, and I did eventually find it, and it was bad. Really disappointing poem, really like a sort of bad pub rock band tribute act to Ashbery. It was terrible. It was too obviously trying to purloin the ideas of collage that he used in a manner that just was neither edifying nor particularly joyful or word with language in the way that Ashbery did. I was kind of crushed by this for about 2 days. And I thought maybe instead I could just talk more generally about the slightly less visible, when I'm not trying to force it, I guess, the influence that Ashbery has had on my work since I started writing poetry. When I first encountered Ashbery's poems when I was 17, and I was working in a second-hand bookshop in Crewkerne in the southwest of England, not an intellectual hotbed of art or poetry or really anything, Crewkerne. And this bookshop no longer exists. In fact, the street that this bookshop was on no longer exists. A giant Waitrose is now in its place. And the point where the automatic doors open and close is where the desk that I used to sit at and serve 2 to 3 customers a day in a 9-hour shift. It was a curiously well-stocked bookshop, but I've never been able to ascertain why exactly that was. It had some wonderful stuff. Quite a big poetry section, where I found a copy of Ashbery's selected poems. It started with the A's, obviously, and then just stopped there on Ashbery. And every shift I would read in order the selected poems and found it just shocking and inspiring and revitalising in a way that, I guess, an awful lot of poetry of the UK hadn't really done for me, or wasn't really, or I hadn't really found the right stuff. I was a kid, it's fine. But this was kind of a formative encounter, I suppose, for how I thought about how I might be able to try to write poetry as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and about the kind of some of the manoeuvres and techniques within the work that struck me at the time, that have kind of continued to strike me since. And I'll finish on some brief little excerpts from a collection I'm trying to work on at the moment about the Book of Jonah, from about the most openly absurdist book of the Bible, and stuff about divination and the drawing of lots, which that is full of, and kind of bibliomancy as well, the act of sort of the ritual of opening a book at random, finding a phrase and trying to live your life in accordance with that phrase, whatever it is. And that kind of, I guess, that sort of aleatory quality, that element of chance and of surprise is something that really delighted me in Ashbery's work. I got really obsessed with the excerpt of the tennis court oath in the selected poems. There's the pleasure of the chance juxtapositions, the discovery that only comes via collage and via these kind of radical shifts in register between, sometimes within lines. This is a couple of stanzas from How Much Longer Will I Be Able to Inhabit the Divine Sepulchre, which I really adored as a poem, from the tennis court oath. I just read it. It's about 2/3 of the way through the poem. Behind the steering wheel, the boy took out his own forehead. His girlfriend's head was a green bag of narcissus stems. Okay, you win, but meet me anyway at Cohen's drugstore in 22 minutes. What a marvel is ancient man. Under the tulip roots, he has figured out a way to be a religious animal and would be a mathematician. But where in unsuitable heaven can he get the heat that would make him grow? So we're given, in about the 8th stanza of the poem, this distorted dialogue between a young couple in a car arranging to meet again later. And through the stems and the roots of the flowers, as well as the sepulchre of the title, which gets reincorporated by the end of the poem, are invited to enter this kind of just subterranean space, this kind of backstage area to what is brought forth. If we stay with the couple, what is brought forth in their conversation and in their relationship overall. And then there's the kind of a leitmotif in a way of the comedy of incongruity and these kind of floating statements. So as an exclamation put next to the simple dialogue between the couple arranging to meet, "What a marvel is ancient man!" exclamation mark is pleasingly out of place. We could attribute it as dialogue to the boy who has taken out his own forehead. It could be a subtextual thought after the practical instruction. It could be the girlfriend's reaction to that instruction, or it could be a kind of authorial intervention, and one which undermines the authority of the author, the supposed wisdom of the poet, insofar as this is a contemporary scene, or it absurdly underlines it in that one day, if the human race survives, this small and insignificant moment will itself be ancient history, its customs at least slightly inscrutable. What a marvel is ancient man, while also inferring that the phrase quite likely comes from whatever source the poet had to hand, opened one of 4 books at random or turned on the radio. The he then becomes generalised, relating not to the boy, although we could continue to read it that way, but to ancient humankind, a tangent taken from a willfully discordant interjection. We follow it not despite its arbitrariness, but because of it. The pleasure of the text, as Bart puts it, is that moment when my body pursues its own ideas, for my body does not have the same ideas as I do. For me, Ashbery is a poet who dramatises that moment from the pleasures of the text over and over again, produces that ever out of reach conflation between our ideas and the ideas of our bodies that we can't articulate. In the system from 3 poems, again, one of my favourite collections of his, it seemed for a moment that a new point had now been reached. It was not the time for digressions, but it made them inevitable, like a curtain at the end of an act. In 3 poems, we are always reaching these new points, a new moment where things are finally going to start. In a liturgy, the repeated exhortations to which the call response is "Lord have mercy" always starts with "we pray," which describes or expresses a desire to undertake an act rather than being the act itself. We're not actually praying. So when does the actual prayer start? When we die, presumably. There's also a disappointment to return to how much longer can I inhabit the divine sepulchre, a kind of laundry bag to the stomach sort of disappointment. The heaven that we live in is not so much imperfect as unsuitable heaven. So many of the causes in that poem, the half-lines could be titles themselves. It's unsuitable for our development. Whoever it is heaven for, it isn't us. And there's a kind of hint towards our unrealised potential of what we desire, maybe being undue and disproportionate anyway, this constant restless frustration which kind of massively appealed to me as a teenager and kind of still does, to bring forth, to paraphrase 3 poems again, the way an apple tree brings forth apples, obliviously innocent of the operation, but unable to do anything else. And that's poetry. And I guess what I responded to in Ashbery at quite an early stage was that superior brain feel, the fixing, refixing of the heart and mind, that way of capturing the feeling of the thought itself, or the feeling of the mind that had the thought, that inarticulable sense. And there's something prayer-like I found in Ashbery's poetry, instructions for contemplation in The Cloud of Unknowing, which was another book I kind of picked up at random in the second-hand bookshop that I worked in, instructing you in how to meditate properly. In a word, let this thing deal with you and lead you as it will. Let it be active and you passive. Watch it if you like, but let it alone. Do not interfere with it as though you would help, for fear that you should spoil it all. And this can be, as The Cloud of Unknowing warns us, fruitful of error as well, but why would it not be? In Ashbery, I find that the errors are kind of a huge part of it, and a part of the expression through the undercutting, the constant kind of self-deprecation or uncertainty, point 6 that was referenced earlier in the recipe for a New York School poem, and quite often following the more sort of florid or lyrical pronouncements, there's a sense of like, I'm getting carried away with this. In the skaters, the tiresome old man is telling us his life story, fully aware of the hubris, unable to stop, only to gesture at the likely futility of the gesture under the roots. that kind of spiritual restlessness, which is something I'm obsessed with trying to explore in my own work, is something I kind of find Ashbery returning to again and again over many collections. He visits that, the Tony Sepulchre in Your Name Here, the collection from the year 2000, the poem The Gods of Fairness, which begins, we just gave up then and there, some of us dying, others walking wearily but contentedly away. God had had his little joke, but who was to say it wasn't ours? Nobody, apparently, which could be why the subject was never raised in discussion groups in old houses along the harbour, some of them practically falling into it. In that brief stanza, I guess one of the other things that's always delighted me about Ashbery is those hugely specific locations, the little rotting harbour, some of the houses practically falling into the river. The way those are woven so seamlessly into the ideas, into the restlessness, is something, I guess, again, just something that I try to aspire to, an aesthetic that I try to reuse, often fall very far short of. In the same poem, in The Gods of Fairness, again, conjures an image of the mind of God, coated with seed pearls and diamonds. There they are for the taking. Take them away, deposit them in whatever suburban bank you choose. Hurry before he changes his mind again. There's a kind of M dash before again, which I quite like. There's a kind of sort of eye roll. He is going to change his mind again. From the 9th line of The Gods of Fairness, the entire kind of hysterical exaltation is delivered partly to a peeing man who seems not to be paying attention to what is being said as well. And that kind of constant shift in who is being addressed and who is being spoken to, and whether they're even paying attention or not, whether they even understand, again, is something that I sort of love and that I often try to recreate, however deliberately. I'll just finish on a few poems from Jonah rather than reading my terrible Ashbery tribute. Well, I'll find it later. I'll send it. I'll email it to you. So these are So this is some excerpts from a sequence of notional phrases, so paintings that don't actually exist in a variety of different styles, imagining that they do, based on the first 3 verses of the Book of Jonah, which begins, it was early morning. 3. I forget the artistic movements that I was drawing on here. I've got a version of this with footnotes that made that clear. I don't know, maybe we can put it. 3. 12 studies for Jonah. Let's do a few of them. 3. It is early morning. A real Jonah would remove a crumb of sleepy dust with an untrimmed fingernail from his eyelid. So, you meet people who want to know the names of the characters in the parables made up to illustrate something. But the Englishman, but the Scottishman, how was he dressed? What did he do for a living? Sitcom writers have never had any other job, but then they have to write characters with jobs, and the only job they can describe with any authority is sitcom writer, eating from a box of glazed mini donuts called pearlescent tears as the helicopter bobs and adjusts itself at the wide boardroom window like a float ball in a cistern. How long before the hail of bullets? I don't know anyone who tells jokes. I feel blessed in this respect. I know people who, without warning, gaze into the middle distance in silence for minutes on end. This is maybe a new kind of joke. Who among us has not woken one day to find that we are an imitation? 4. It was early morning. Jonah looked very annoyed. The outward and visible world. I think about this every day. I cannot stop thinking about it. I have tried very hard. Those around him had to choose. He was wired directly to the heavens, or possessed by a demon, or he was having a psychotic episode. It's like when you go anywhere, everyone thinks there you go, doing your thing because of such and such, but they're wrong, that is not it at all. The coffee ran over the sides of the copper pot. The flood started so slowly and said, okay, but I love you. The animals we domesticated remained unknowable. When evidence to the contrary was presented, we thought I heard about something like this before, and it was what we thought before. Closed captions, gold-tipped tusks, a homeopathic cure for lust. What's scary is that it works. 6. It is early morning. 5 wordless actions, experience speech, the word of the. Jonah seals himself under the floorboards. He can hear the footsteps of his daughters, Little Dove, Cinnamon Flower, and Cosmetics Box. It would seem they are dancing. He sees it as a zoetrope through the cracks. It is not clear how long he will be able to keep this up. non-diegetic breathing, a feather resting on the airstream like an angel, lambent or recumbent. Eventually all our graves go untended, overgrown between the back-to-backs. In his head a flea, a mole and a swine, their continuing adventures. Even so, they keep looking to camera. My charmed, irregular daughters, never stop dancing. You are going to meet such extraordinary and such wretched people, but please untie the pizza delivery guy. 9. I know a nurse, I know a cop, my sisters work in agitprop. 11. It was early morning, on plan air, dabs of migraine halo, a milk-white sun, and the flowers seemed to shield their rheumy eyes. The thing that matters is what continually happens, the gnat alighting on wet paint, blotches of pollen in the wet paint, blotches of pollen in the mind's eye. I love to go from room to room with you, so much later, the way you don't try to control your hair when we kiss, a photo of a real person but emulsified, and the closeness of Yahweh to human beings differs from novel to novel. So much later, from room to room, so much later, where the derision the work was met with gets sucked into the vents. Thank you.